Started. So, welcome to today's webinar on Duke Energy's political power in North Carolina. NC Warren, for any of you guys who don't know, is a nearly 40-year-old, has a nearly 40-year-old history of advocating for environmental and climate justice here in North Carolina. Over the years, we have partnered with a variety of groups and allies who have done amazing advocacy and energy policy research in our state, including the Energy and Policy Institute, or EPI. EPI is a watchdog organization that investigates and exposes the harms posed by fossil fuel and utility companies to ratepayers, communities, and the climate. Their work has really helped shine a light on bad corporate behavior and the policies and systems that have forced communities, especially communities of color and low-income people, to bear the burdens of our energy system. We're incredibly honored to work with EPI, and especially with Sue Sturgis, who is EPI's research and communication manager. Sue is an award-winning energy policy researcher and a journalist who has spent decades investigating energy, climate, and environmental politics across the Southeast. Her reporting on Duke Energy has been particularly important to NC Warren's advocacy and our understanding of the utility's influence in North Carolina. We really value Sue's integrity, her expertise, and contributions to the fight for a more equitable energy system, and we're very grateful to have her here with us today. So with that, I'm excited to turn things over to Sue. Sue, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Gabby. It's really great to be here today. And I just wanted to acknowledge the elephant in the room, shall we say, which is the incredible heat we're experiencing today. I'm in Raleigh. We're under an extreme heat warning today. I am one of the few people who still lives in North Carolina without air conditioning. So I'm really feeling it. And I wanted to acknowledge that, climate has been a big part of my work, and it's been a big part of my work around Duke Energy. But this presentation today does not focus on climate, but I would really like to bring that into the room with us and really have that as the backdrop of everything we're going to talk about today. So I think Gabby has introduced me adequately, and so I'd like to just go ahead and jump into the presentation. Let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about first. Actually, let me go ahead. I'm going to share my slides, and then we'll get started. Okay. All right. Can you see that okay, Gabby? Is everything showing up? All right. Terrific. All right. All right. Well, as I said, thank you so much for being here today about this topic. I want to talk about how Duke Energy became and stays the most powerful private actor in North Carolina politics. To understand Duke's power, we need to understand its monopoly status, from which it derives this power and which it uses its power then to protect. So this isn't a story about one bad decision. Oh, I'm sorry, I have the slide in the wrong place. Let me escape out of here and get to the right spot. Okay. All right. Can you see that now, Gabby? Are we at slide one?
Yes, but it's not in the
Not in the
presentation mode.
slideshow. Okay, how's
Yeah,
that? There we
now
go.
it looks great.
All right, sorry about that. Sorry for starting out on the wrong slide. So, as I was saying, this isn't a story about one bad decision or one bad law, but it's really a story about a series of decisions over quite a long time made by people that built a monopoly and then built the political machine to protect that monopoly. And because this system was built by decisions, it can be changed by decisions too. And so that's really the argument underneath everything that I'm about to talk to you about today. So let's first talk about what I'm going to talk about. So this presentation has four basic parts. I want to talk first of all about how Duke Power Monopoly actually got built to begin with. Then we'll look at how the company consolidated into the corporate and political giant that it is today. We'll look at what that political machine actually produces. And finally, we'll look at where Duke's power is running into real trouble right now in North Carolina and beyond. So first, we're going to start at the beginning with building Duke power. So this story starts with James Buchanan Buck Duke from Durham. That's his portrait right there. That's from the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery. Duke was a tobacco monopolist, and his American Tobacco Company was broken up by federal antitrust action back in 1911. But starting in 1904, Duke partnered with a doctor named W. Gill Wiley to dam the Catawba River for electricity. They incorporated Southern Power Company in 1905. And here's a really important detail. The customers were not homes. The customers were textile mills. Southern Power started serving residential customers only after the mill owners insisted that their workers needed electricity. So the company was then renamed Duke Power in 1924. So the takeaway I want you to get from this slide is that Duke's electricity followed industry, not people. And this set a pattern. Duke's whole design logic from day one was built around what benefited large customers first. That might sound familiar to anyone who's following the data center rate debates today. Then we took the first step towards monopoly in North Carolina. It wasn't built out of just one law. It took two steps to create the monopoly, and these came decades apart. So first, a little bit of background so you understand the regulatory system that oversees Duke, which is an investor-owned utility. Now, understand that it is privately owned by shareholders, and it's regulated by the state. So in 1899, the state created the Corporation Commission, which was the ancestor of today's regulator, the Utilities Commission. By 1913, that Corporation Commission had rate setting power over electric utilities. Then there was a reorganization during the Depression, and that's when the modern NCUC was created in 1941 as a multi-member board. But even before that happened, something really critical took place in the early 1930s. Starting then, any new utility needed something called a certificate of public convenience and necessity, essentially a state-issued permit, before it could start operating. To get one, you had to prove that to the state that there was a real unmet need for a new provider. And the existing utilities actually got a say in whether that need really existed. So that was real protection for the incumbent utilities like Duke and CP&L, but it's not yet an exclusive territorial guarantee. So the law that actually locked in the monopoly didn't come until 1965. April 20th, 1965, specifically. So before then, Duke Power and the municipal utilities that serve cities and the rural electric cooperatives could actually compete for the same customers on the edges of their territories. And that produced exactly what you'd expect. Their courts at the time described it as frequent litigation and uneconomic duplication of transmission and distribution systems. So in plain English, that meant competing companies sometimes built duplicate power lines down the same roads, and then they were fighting over the same handful of customers. But the Electric Act of 1965 gave the Utilities Commission the authority to assign fixed exclusive territories permanently. And Duke, the co-ops, and the municipalities all jointly asked the legislature for this. So this was an industry negotiated deal. Nobody imposed this on the utilities. While I was doing research for this, I found a newspaper clipping from just a few months before this law passed from the Sanford Herald in January of 1965. And it was praising the incoming governor, Dan Moore, for appointing a negotiating team of industry leaders to hammer out this deal before the legislation started. So this wasn't lawmakers acting on their own initiative, but it was actually choreographed by the industry itself. So the monopoly policy was negotiated by the very companies that benefited from it. So that's a little bit about how the monopoly was built. I want to talk now about how Duke as a company got bigger and then how it got political. So this is the slide you already saw. We moved from Duke Power to a six-state energy giant over the course of just a few years, really. Started in 1997 when Duke Power merged with Pan Energy, and at that point it became Duke Energy. Then in 2006, it acquired Synergy, which was based in Ohio, expanded into the Midwest. In 2012, it acquired Progress Energy, and that one is worth a footnote because within 2 hours of that deal closing, Duke's board forced out the CEO, who they had told regulators would run the combined company, in what basically amounted to a boardroom coup. Then in 2016, Duke bought Piedmont Natural Gas for $4.9 billion dollars. And now this is a natural gas company that serves the Carolinas as well as Tennessee. Today, Duke has 8.2 million customers across 6 states. And the states that it serves are North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. It's the largest US utility by some measures. And to help you wrap your head around just how big Duke Energy actually is, consider that last year alone, the company's annual profit was $4.9 billion. That's billion with a B. And it has one of the most highly paid CEOs. Harry Sedaris, you'll see his total compensation last year was $13.7 million, but that was only for part of a year because there was a leadership change last year. But we had previously seen salaries over $20 million. And so Duke didn't just get bigger as a company, but it also built this massive political machine that we're talking about today. And I wanted to show you the components all together before we go through them one by one, because I think it sort of helps you take it in and understand the system that we're talking about. So the kinds of influences we're talking about are the money, the political spending, the lobbying, and they'd have both in-house and contract lobbyists. Then there's ratepayer funded influence. And we're going to talk about this in a few. And this is basically when you're being billed for things in your ordinary electric bills that then are going towards influence peddling. Then we have the close connections that Duke creates with the various regulatory authorities, from the legislature to the Utilities Commission to the courts. There's narrative power. And this is when Duke uses its influence and its money to shape what politicians believe is safe to support before there's ever even any discussion. And then finally, we're going to talk about philanthropy, which can function as a way to buy silence from potential critics. And we're going to take these now one at a time. So first of all, just a few facts I wanted to share with you about Duke's money. Currently, in the current legislature, 62% of lawmakers have accepted Duke Energy campaign contributions. That's about $2.5 million over the past decade. Nearly a quarter of current lawmakers have taken $10,000 or more from Duke over their entire careers, and this cuts across party lines. I would note that Senator Dan Blue, who's a Democrat, has taken $70,900 from Duke over his career, while Senator Bill Rabon, a Republican, has taken $60,900. And a trend that I'd really like to note here for you to keep in mind is that Duke's PAC giving became sharply partisan in North Carolina after 2010. And you might recall that was the year that Republicans won control of the legislature and began a gerrymandering push. But in some years, Duke's share of giving to Republican legislators has actually exceeded Republican share of legislative seats by up to 25% some years. And that was according to some research that I did. Then last year, Duke found a new way to give directly to state politics. It contributed from its corporate funds for the very same time straight to the state Republican Party, using a loophole in North Carolina's ban on corporate to party donations. And just very briefly, this was to their building fund that it contributed. Um, and I want to spend just a minute on the last item on this slide because I think it's a really illuminating example of how Duke sometimes moves its money out of public view. It's not always just about PAC donations, which are reported and pretty easy to see, what's happening with those. Duke funds a political nonprofit called Citizens for a Responsible Energy Future, or CREF, C-R-E-F. And Duke is the sole disclosed donor to this group, so it's the only donating entity. In January of this year, CREF transferred $200,000 from its accounts to a super PAC that's tied up with the Chamber of Commerce called Citizens for NC Jobs Action. And then that group spent the money backing Senate President pro tem Phil Berger in his primary election against Rockingham County Sheriff Sam Page. And Berger lost that primary by 23 votes. Duke's own PAC also gave to Berger directly. It gave him $30,800 directly across 6 separate contributions between 2022 and 2025. CEO Harry Sedaris personally donated the legal maximum to Berger's campaign just 2 weeks after that CREF money moved to Berger. And at the same time all this was happening, Duke had an active regulatory matter pending in Berger's own district, a gas plant interconnection filing. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what all that money was about. Now we'll talk a little bit about lobbying. Currently, right at this moment, Duke has 11 registered lobbyists in Raleigh alone. And they've not hesitated to use that lobbying power. Back in 2021, Duke was the only organization that directly lobbied against a bill that simply proposed studying regional power market reform. They did not even want it studied. And so we'll come back to talk about this in a few minutes. I also want to note that last year's Senate Bill 261, which was also Senate Bill 266, which benefited Duke and which we're also going to talk about a little more, was reportedly written by Duke's own lobbyists, and then it was carried by a former Duke executive who became a state senator. And I want to note that lobbying isn't only about legislators, it's also aimed at the executive branch. So Duke lobbies the governor's office, the Department of Environmental Quality, the Department of Agriculture. In fact, back in 2021, the Utilities Commission adopted rules that required utilities to log their lobbying contacts with those executive agencies. And here's something that is really worth knowing about. That log is not actually available to you and me. The public can't access it. When this information, the names, salaries, and expenses of Duke's lobbying personnel showed up in Duke's current rate case, which is before the Utilities Commission, Duke filed the entire schedule under seal, citing a blanket trade secret claim that they never explained item by item why lobbyist salary would be a trade secret. So the requirement to keep these records exists, but the public's ability to see it does not. A little bit about ratepayer-funded influence. And the point of this is that we're seeing Duke's political muscle being paid for by some of the very customers that muscle gets used against, right? A few years back, public staff, and that is the official state's ratepayer advocate before the Utilities Commission, caught Duke trying to bill customers $2.8 million in advertising, lobbying, and business association costs in a single rate case. And just so you understand, under the law and under the rules, Duke is only supposed to be charging customers for the reasonable costs of getting their power. And so, you begin questioning, well, advertising, lobbying, that's not a basic function of getting power to my house, right? And so they had estimated that 526,000 of that was improperly charged dues to the Edison Electric Institute, which is the utility industry's own trade association. Now, last year, a bill was introduced at the legislature called the North Carolina Consumer Protection Act, and that would have completely closed this loophole. So Duke would not have been able to send part of this money to the Edison Electric Institute. But though it was introduced, it never moved. It got no votes taken on it. It just died. And now, even after all of this scrutiny, the Utilities Commission still allows utilities to recover from customers the so-called research and educational portion of trade association dues. And Jim Warren, the executive director of NC Warren, has a really great line about this. He says Duke has gamed that category time after time. A little bit about how these rules limiting this kind of spending came to be. And they trace back to a 2013 Duke Energy Carolinas rate case. And in that case, NC Warren caught the company miscoding over $1 million in political contributions as costs recoverable from customers. Duke's own defense of what it did was that the error was pretty good relative to its revenue. But the Utility Commission said no, they were actually quite disturbed and concerned about the company's accounting errors. And so this led to a formal petition being filed in November 2018 by NC Warren and Friends of the Earth asking the Utilities Commission for three things. They asked for no recovery of influence spending at all, mandatory annual disclosure of that spending, and a ban on parent companies spending ratepayer derived money that's transferred up to them from the utilities. The way Duke is structured in North Carolina, it has the Duke Energy Carolinas utility, the Duke Energy Progress utilities, and then there's the holding company. And so they were addressing the movement of the utility money to the holding companies. And so the central argument in this was that treating utility money as cleanly separable into a shareholder bucket and a ratepayer bucket is an accounting fiction. And just so you understand, when Duke goes before the Utility Commission to get its approval for, what it's basically its income, what it's going to get paid, they talk about above the line expenses. And so when you hear that, they're talking about those reasonable expenses that can be charged to the ratepayers. You'll also hear them talk about below the line expenses. And so those are the kinds of expenses like lobbying that the ratepayers are not supposed to be paying, but the shareholders instead are supposed to be paying. So just so you understand that, that's the kind of lingo you're going to hear. Um, all right. Next, I want to talk a bit about these close connections. And so some people might refer to this as the revolving door. And so this is, we see people from Duke Energy rotating onto regulatory authorities, and we see people from those authorities getting involved with Duke Energy. So that's a really important source of its power. And I want to talk about that a little bit by giving you some examples of how that's worked in the past. Starting with the executive branch. A few years back, we had Governor Pat McCrory, who had been a 28-year Duke Energy employee, getting to appoint the entire Utilities Commission while he was in office. We've since changed how we appoint the Utilities Commission, and the governor can no longer appoint the full commission. But back then they did. And McCrory, even though he had worked for Duke for most of his career, was allowed to appoint the Utilities Commission. So that's the kind of connections I'm talking about. Then moving over to the legislature, former state senator Paul Newton, who before being president, before being elected a state senator, served as the president of Duke's North Carolina operations. He was the guy who introduced Senate Bill 261 last year, which eliminated Duke's interim climate targets and also made it easier to bill ratepayers in advance for power plants and other things that are not built yet. He resigned from the Senate to take a job at UNC some months before the legislature passed and then overrode the veto of the resulting bill. But he was still there to run that bill, and he was the spokesperson for that bill when they were considering it. Then the Utility Commission itself. I would note that the current commission is down to 5 members. Of the current 5 members of the Utility Commission, 3 of them are former state legislators who all received tens of thousands of dollars from Duke Energy. And the other 2 members of the commission either worked for Duke or Duke's predecessor, CP&L. So again, very close connections on the Utility Commission. And so let's talk a little bit about the appointments to the Utility Commission. We talked a bit about how it's been shrunk down. That happened in 2023, and this was a law sponsored by Senator Phil Berger, who had taken $6,400 from Duke's PAC that year. He sponsored a bill that cut the commission from 7 seats to 5 seats, and it gave the legislature 2 direct picks instead of the governor. And it was at that point that the lawmakers chose William Brawley and Tommy Tucker, who'd taken $26,600 and $11,000 respectively from Duke over their careers, and then both became swing votes in a Duke rate case months later. Then there was another bill, Senate Bill 382 in 2024, that cut the governor's own share to 2 of 5. So the governor no longer was appointing the majority of the Utility Commission, and they gave the other appointment to the state treasurer, who's currently a Republican. So that gives the Republicans control over the majority of the Utility Commission, which is a tremendous break with past policy in North Carolina. Now, Governor Stein has sued over this, but he's lost so far at every level. And we have the treasurer's pick sitting on the commission. And this is Donald Vandervaart, our former secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality, who is a climate skeptic. And he's been voting on cases for over a year now. These connections sometimes continue even after the person rotates out of a key position. And we saw that on the commission. For a time, the chair of the Utilities Commission was Charlotte Mitchell. And when Charlotte Mitchell left the commission shortly after, she joined McGuire Woods, which is a law firm that represents Duke Energy. So you see again how Duke benefits from those connections. And finally, I want to mention the courts. We talked a bit about how there's currently a case related to Duke before the North Carolina courts, headed to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Paul Newby has ruled on Duke cases while his wife has held Duke stock. She reports holding over $10,000 in Duke stock currently, and he's been ruling on Duke cases. And keep in mind also that Phil Berger's son, Justice Phil Berger Jr., sits on the court. And now Phil Berger Sr. sponsored the 2023 law that reshaped the commission. And then we had the younger Phil Berger join the majority in upholding a Duke rate hike that was done by the new commission. So there's a lot of conflicts because of these close connections. Just briefly about narrative power, I just wanted to note that the public messaging matters because it shapes what policymakers think is safe to support. And Duke spends a lot of money to shape the narrative. And as an example, back in 2019, ads started appearing on Facebook calling regional power markets, which are an alternative to monopolies, a failed experiment, was the language they used. These ads were sponsored by a group called Energy Consumers of the Carolinas. This is a dark money nonprofit, does not disclose its donors, but its executive director had spent 6 years working for Duke Energy, including as an officer of the Duke Energy Foundation, and had also done PR work for the Duke CEO. Then by 2020, we saw ads with the same message calling these markets federal overreach were showing up on Google searches in North Carolina, and the sponsor was never confirmed. When asked about it, Duke didn't respond initially, but then it denied ever contributing to that group or having any relationship to the ads at all. But then in 2021, we had a case where the money trail really got documented. The Duke funded Citizens for a Responsible Energy Future, that's the CREF group I mentioned previously, ran an ad campaign with the tagline, "A really terrible option," aimed at the regional power market reform study. CREF had recently received $500,000 directly from Duke. And so the through line in all of this narrative strategy is you frame a topic as settled, radical, or risky before anybody even has to take a public position on it. And then philanthropy. And sometimes people are confused by this, that we would include philanthropy under political power. Um, but I think it's really important to look at how Duke Energy runs its charitable giving. So currently it's giving about $30 million to $33 million a year in grants. And EPI had done some research on its giving, and we had looked at the period from 2013 to 2017, and we had estimated its total charitable giving in that time, looking at both the foundation and also some corporate giving, and we totaled over 306 million in that 5-year period. And here's the part that I think really shows you how this is a political tool rather than just ordinary charity. Duke's own current foundation guidelines explicitly disqualify any nonprofit from getting a grant that is, in their words, an opposing or an intervening party, or that actively opposes Duke Energy on social media. So let me just say that again. Eligibility for Duke's charity is conditioned on not criticizing Duke. And I'm going to tell you a story that makes this concrete. Back in 2015, Duke gave a combined $229,000 to Black community organizations across North Carolina. That was the same year that Duke was accused of sending messengers directly into Black churches around the state, spreading the message that solar power hurts the poor. And this was a campaign against the Energy Freedom Act, which was a bill that would have let customers buy solar power directly from independent companies instead of only from Duke. NC Warren's Jim Warren co-signed a public letter with Reverend Nelson Johnson of Greensboro at the time, calling out that tactic directly to Duke's CEO. And so this is why NC Warren's 2018 petition, the one that led to the 2021 spending rules that we discussed, specifically named well-aimed philanthropy as one of the tools inside Duke's estimated $80 million a year in political influence spending in the Carolinas. So that's the machine, all six parts of it. And so now we're going to look a bit at what this machine actually produces. So first of all, we have no regional transmission organization in the Southeast. Now, most of the Midwest and the Northeast run their power markets through these RTOs, which, as I noted, are independent bodies that create real competitive wholesale power markets. The Southeast, including North Carolina, has none of these. The Brattle Group Consultancy estimated back in 2019 that North Carolina Duke customers would save $500 million a year if Duke were part of the PJM regional market. In 2021, that's when Duke gave that $500,000 to Citizens for a Responsible Energy Future to run the ad campaign against the bill to study that idea. Duke's public framing is that a real RTO would transfer critical aspects of its operations to a federally run body. But remember that Duke participates in RTOs for its Midwest utilities. Here in the Southeast, Duke has created this alternative called SEAM, or the Southeast Energy Exchange Market, which is really a very limited trading system, and it has not produced the kind of cost savings that Brattle's talking about. Then there's also the coal ash settlement. You're right, you might remember a few years back when coal ash contamination was a very prominent issue across the state because of all the leaks and spills from Duke facilities. And so now who has to pay to clean up that mess? The total projected cost of the coal ash cleanup is $8 billion. And so, this goes back to the 2014 Dan River spill, and then the state passed the Coal Ash Management Act. And for quite a few years, regulators, the Attorney General, the Sierra Club fought Duke's cost recovery requests for these coal ash cleanup spills, right? Um, but they got a settlement that has us on the hook for it. And so if you look at the numbers in that settlement, we're still paying for the large majority of that cleanup. And in turn, they knocked $1.1 billion off Duke's original ask. But at the same time, Duke has the right to earn a profit on what's left of the cleanup balance going forward. And so it actually turns that liability into an ongoing revenue stream because of the way the settlement is structured. So those are some of the big outcomes that Duke's Power has produced. But one of the things I wanted to note is that right now, Duke's running into some problems in North Carolina and even beyond North Carolina, and I want to talk about it. Duke's political position in the state isn't the same as it was a few years ago, and I think that's really important to note. Um, I've been following Duke rate cases for quite a few years, both as a reporter and now as a researcher with EPI, and I have never seen so much pushback for a rate hike request from Duke Energy before. So clearly we've seen things have changed here. So in these current rate cases, Duke is currently seeking rate hikes for both Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress. They wanted an 18% rate increase for both of those. There was enormous pushback against that. And so after that was expressed, Duke came back and lowered its ask to 9.5%. This was in a settlement proposal over 2 years. But the Attorney General, Jeff Jackson, is still opposing even that reduced ask. And Duke is also lowering its requested return on equity. Return on equity is basically It's the return on its investments. It's essentially its profit margin. And that request followed the same arc. Duke it came out asking for 10.95%, initially lowered the ask to 10.48%, then lowered it again in that settlement we mentioned to 9.8%. But it's still contested. The public staff is saying no more than 9.45, and the Attorney General says that should be no more than 7.4%. And it's probably worth noting that last week, Attorney General Jackson busted Duke Energy for giving incorrect testimony under oath about what the proposed rate hike would mean for residential customers. And it's really being watchdog this year. And I would note that bills overall are up 22% just since 2020. And so that's a result of the base rate hikes that we're talking about, but also fuel charges and storm recovery costs. And this pushback that Duke is experiencing is not only limited to North Carolina, and it's also not limited only to Duke. We at EPR are seeing pushback against utilities across the country. So, for example, in Georgia, there were 6 Georgia Power rate hikes in 2 years, and the people were furious over it. And last year, there was an election last November, and they elect their PSC in Georgia. And 2 incumbent utility commissioners were voted out, and the first Democrats were elected to that commission in 20 years. So that was a very historic change. It's indicating something's changed, something's happening. People are paying attention, right? Then also in Alabama, there's been a lot of agitation around utilities there. And I should note that in both Georgia and Alabama, the owner of these individual utilities is Southern Company. In Alabama, there has not been a real rate hearing since 1981. And so in 2026, this spring, the primary voters ousted an incumbent commissioner because of anger over this. And it was a 75 to 25% vote split. But unfortunately, there, the legislature then shifted the future appointments to the governor. So, the pushback gets pushback sometimes. Then in Michigan, there's really interesting things happening in Michigan right now. Utility commissioners there are not elected, as in North Carolina, but a coalition has come together there that's pursuing a ballot measure to ban utility political contributions directly. No political contributions from any utilities in the state if this passes, and it has qualified for the November ballot. And then in other states, let me tell you a little bit about the pushback Duke is experiencing. So in Florida, over the past couple of years, we've seen this campaign rise up that's now called the Dump Duke campaign. And so these are municipalization campaigns. These are cities in Florida saying that, we've granted Duke Energy a franchise to serve our city, but we don't think we've been served well by that. And so now we want to take that back and we're going to operate our own municipal utility. And so this has already happened before in Florida. Back in 2003, Winter Park, Florida did that, and they were Progress franchise at the time. Um, And so more recently, we've seen municipalization campaigns rise up in Clearwater and in St. Petersburg under the Dump Duke banner. Now, earlier this month, Clearwater's municipalization campaign ended when the city signed a new 30-year agreement with Duke. And that was even though the city's own independent appraisal found that municipalizing would have saved residents about 15% on their bills. But now St. Petersburg is still weighing a similar municipalization campaign or plan. So you may be wondering, could we municipalize in North Carolina? No, we can't. We would have to change the law to do this in North Carolina. Um, Florida franchise agreements include a contractual right where the city can buy the local grid when the contract expires, and they have a neutral arbitrator set the price if the two sides can't agree. And that's what they did in Winter Park, right? And even in Winter Park, Progress Energy sued to stop that, but they went ahead anyway with the vote, and the voters approved the bond, 69 to 31 in Winter Park. But now the franchises in North Carolina don't include that same right. And that 1965 Electric Act that we discussed earlier was specifically written to prevent this kind of change. So if this were to happen in North Carolina, we'd need a legislature that would change this law. But that doesn't mean that the monopoly has not been challenged in North Carolina before. And I wanted to mention this campaign that we saw a few years back. And so this was led by NC Warren. It was called Energy Justice NC. The other groups involved in it included Appalachian Voices, the Center for Biological Diversity, Food and Water Watch, and the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And so they were pushing to end Duke's monopoly in North Carolina. The goal was real energy choice for customers and also getting state officials to stop taking Duke's political contributions. And obviously, this didn't end Duke's monopoly. We still have its monopoly here, but it did get people to think about, and it got reporters to write about the possibility. So it continues the conversation. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about some potential avenues for change, just as, food for thought for the discussion to come. There's a few lever points where, with the proper pressure, people in North Carolina could make change when it comes to Duke's monopoly and the way Duke operates. First of all, there's legislative reform. North Carolina could, for instance, change the franchise law so municipalization could become a reality. It could also close the ratepayer-funded lobbying loophole that the Utility Commission left open back in 2021. Rulemakings and petitions at the Utilities Commission is another avenue for change, and we've seen this has worked before. We saw the 2018 petition that produced the political spending rules that we have today, so that shows that the regulators can be pushed, even without new legislation. Electing responsive officials is an important avenue for change. As we discussed, legislative leaders in the state treasurer now control 3 of the Utility Commission's 5 seats. And Georgia and Alabama showed how ratepayer anger can flip elections. Could this happen in the legislative elections? It's certainly possible. And then finally, organizing and public pressure. Earlier this year, when there was a tremendous cold snap, people were hit with bills, Duke Energy bills, that caused a lot of alarm, to say the least. And 70,000 people signed a petition calling for a Duke Energy billing audit to figure out what the heck was going on with their bills. Um, yeah, so those are some possibilities. And then also coalitions like Energy Justice NC show the organizing potential. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Gabby and let her take it from here, and then we'll have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that amazing presentation. It was super detailed, but in a really fascinating and engaging way. It was really, I don't want to say great to hear all of those items. It wasn't great, but it was super informative. And I'm really glad that we were able to hear from someone with so much expertise on this issue. We are going to jump into a Q&A session shortly. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. You can click the Q&A button and we'll get to those. Just briefly, I just want to acknowledge, I really love how this presentation outlines how Duke Energy has exercised and built its power in North Carolina, and more importantly, how people and movements across the country have really challenged Duke and how they've also challenged other similar utilities. I think one of the most important takeaways from this presentation, at least for me, is that the problems that we are facing today are not accidental. Duke Energy is directly responsible for many of the outcomes that we're facing, and it has actively worked to create and maintain a system that really serves its interests. Duke Energy is responsible for the continued expansion of fossil fuels in North Carolina. It is responsible for pushing policies that protect its monopoly and its profits. And through its political influence, through its lobbying, its campaign spending, and its relationships with policymakers and regulators, Duke has really worked to make it harder for North Carolinians to challenge those decisions. And those choices have really cost us. It's affecting our ability to afford to heat and cool our homes. It's polluting our communities, and it's slowing our transition away from fossil fuels, and it's ultimately worsening the climate crisis. But, I want to also say that while it's true that Duke has rigged the system, it's not true that we are powerless, even though sometimes it may feel that way. NC Warren, alongside our allies, have been fighting Duke Energy's influence for decades, and we've had many successes. And these successes really just remind us that even when powerful corporations seem untouchable, people power can overcome corporate power. And when we organize, we can really win. Right now, we have another opportunity to come together to challenge Duke Energy. So, NC Warren is calling on Governor Josh Stein to use his authority and influence to challenge the corporation's continued expansion of fossil fuels and its efforts to suppress renewable energy. Specifically, right now, we're calling on Stein to implement a statewide moratorium on data centers, as Duke is aggressively recruiting them to our state to justify its expansion of polluting power. Duke Energy has enormous influence over all branches of government in North Carolina, including the executive office, like you said, Sue. But the governor has independent tools. And not only that, but he has a stated commitment to addressing climate change and, most importantly, a responsibility to protect the people of North Carolina. So we really see him as a unique change maker. With our campaign to call on Josh Stein, we've already had 30,000 people join our call, and we're asking everyone in this webinar to join it as well if you haven't already. So if you're interested in doing so, you can go to stopdukeenergy.com and send Governor Stein an email, join those 30,000 other folks, and you could also become a member of NC Warren by making a donation. Lastly, I want to boost up EPI. They have a really great newsletter. So if you want to stay up to date with the work that they're doing, please subscribe to their newsletter at the link that we're about to jump in. So with all that being said, I want to say thank you again, Sue, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone for joining us.